What you are about to hear is the story of a man who appeared to have everything, and a secret he carried in silence for 15 years, a secret so heavy that it finally broke on the 6th day of his honeymoon on a quiet mountain road in Colorado, the moment he simply walked away and never looked back. There's a photograph still saved on Natalie's phone that she has never been able to delete. In it, Marcus is standing at the edge of a mountain overlooking Rocky Mountain National Park, his back half turned to the camera, his hands resting quietly inside the pockets of his jacket. The aspen trees behind him are blazing gold in the late September light, their leaves trembling in the thin mountain air like hundreds of small flames that refuse to go out. He is not smiling. He is not looking at the camera. He is simply looking out across the valley below the way. A person looks at something they are memorizing, not admiring. Like a man quietly saying goodbye to something he could not yet name. The photograph was taken on the afternoon of September 21st, 2023. It was the 3rd day of their honeymoon, and it was the last photograph Natalie would ever take of her husband. 6 days after their wedding, Marcus walked around a corner on a quiet street in Estes Park, Colorado, and did not come back. His passport was still inside his carry-on bag in the hotel room. His suitcase was still packed and zipped near the closet. His wedding ring had been on his finger that very afternoon when he left. There was no argument. There was no warning. There was no note left on the pillow. There was only absence, quiet, and absolute arriving without explanation, and filling every corner of a hotel room that still smelled like his cologne. Marcus Elliott Calloway was 39 years old, a structural engineer at a firm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the kind of man who had shown up to work for 12 straight years without a single unexplained absence. He had grown up in Duluth, the son of a steelworker and a retired elementary school teacher, and he carried their values the way Midwest men often do, quietly, without complaint and without question. His colleagues called him reliable, his friends called him solid, and those who loved him called him simply dependable. None of those words, it turned out, told the whole story. Natalie Grace Mercer was 34, a landscape architect from St. Paul who believed and loved the way she believed in gardens, that if you tended carefully enough, if you gave things the right conditions and enough time, everything would eventually bloom. She had loved Marcus for 4 years. She thought she knew the full shape of him. This is the story of a man who followed every rule society wrote for him: the career, the savings account, the ring, the vows. And it is the story of what happens when a person spends too long living someone else's truth. What Marcus left behind on that September afternoon in the Colorado mountains was not just a marriage. It was a question that would take 6 months, a handwritten letter, and a lifetime of unanswered silence to even begin to understand. To understand why Marcus Calloway walked away, you first have to understand the life he walked away from, and how carefully, how lovingly it had been built. They met in July of 2019 at a professional conference in Chicago on an afternoon that started with polite industry small talk and ended at nearly midnight, sitting side by side along the Lake Michigan waterfront, still talking. What had begun as a conversation about structural calculations and landscape design had become something much more personal, honest, and unhurried. By the time Natalie stepped into her cab that night, Marcus had already started looking forward to seeing her again. By the following year, they were sharing a second-floor apartment on the west side of Minneapolis with hardwood floors and windows that caught the afternoon light just right. Saturday mornings meant the farmer's market on Nicollet Mall, canvas bags full of fresh vegetables. Neither of them was quite sure how to cook. Christmas meant the long drive north to Duluth, where Marcus's father sat quiet and steady at the head of the table, and his mother filled every silence with warmth and second helpings, and the particular kind of love that asks nothing in return. On the surface, everything made sense. Everything aligned, and for a while that was enough. But by 2022, a quiet tension had begun to settle between them, the kind that does not arrive loudly but accumulates in the small spaces of a relationship over time. Natalie wanted clarity about their future. She wanted to know they were building towards something real and permanent. And Marcus, each time the conversation moved close to the word marriage, would redirect it carefully toward numbers. Interest rates, he would say. Emergency fund. Long-term stability. His explanations were always reasonable, always practical, and always just enough to close the conversation without resolving what lived underneath it. Behind the spreadsheets and the careful financial planning, something else was living quietly in the dark, and neither of them had found the language for it yet. Then came December of 2022, Christmas Eve at Natalie's parents' home in St. Paul. The living room was warm with string lights and the smell of her mother's pie cooling on the counter, and Marcus got down on one knee in the middle of it, all holding a ring that was simple but clearly carefully chosen. The room broke into applause. Her mother cried, his hands were steady, and Natalie said yes with the relief of a woman who had been waiting not just for the question itself, but for the ground beneath her to finally feel solid. The wedding was held on September 15th, 2023 in a small chapel in uptown Minneapolis. 45 guests, a ceremony that was honest and unhurried, followed by slow smoked brisket, deep dish pizza from a place they both loved, and a playlist Marcus had spent 3 weeks quietly building on his own. Friends who had known him for years described him that evening as composed, warm in the right moments, and steady in the way that quiet Midwest men often are. The morning after September 17th, they drove to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport and boarded a flight south to Denver. Natalie posted a photo from the gate, her head leaning against the window, the runway outside blurred and bright, starting forever in the mountains. It had gathered over 200 likes before they even landed. The first 2 days in Denver unfolded without disruption. A boutique hotel in Lodi, the city's historic lower downtown district, the Denver Art Museum, rooftop dinners, Colorado craft beer poured into heavy pint glasses at a corner bar where the lights were low and the conversation around them was easy. Natalie filled her camera roll. Marcus appeared in some of the photos present, but slightly outside the frame, the way he had always been, just beside the story rather than inside it. On September 20th, they loaded the rental car and drove north toward Estes Park, following Route 34 through Big Thompson Canyon, where sheer granite walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, and the Big Thompson River ran alongside the road below, catching the late September afternoon light and throwing it back in pieces of golden white. Neither of them spoke much. They did not feel like silence that needed to be filled. But there was one moment Natalie would replay in her mind for months afterward, a moment she had dismissed as nothing at the time. On the morning of September 21st, they joined a small guided wildlife tour at Marine Park, one of the wide-open meadows inside Rocky Mountain National Park, where visitors gather each fall to witness the elk rut. The air that morning sat at 45 degrees sharp and clean in the way that only high mountain air in September can be, and the aspen trees lining the ridge above the meadow had already begun their turn, their leaves shifting from green to a deep burning gold that seemed almost too vivid, too insistent to belong to the natural world. And then the sound came, low and rising and ancient, a bugle call from a bull elk somewhere across the valley below, a sound so primal and so completely unself-conscious that several people in the group stopped mid-sentence just to listen. The guide explained it softly. The males call out during rut season to find their mates, she said, and the sound carries for miles. It is both a declaration and a longing all at once. Most of the group smiled and reached for their cameras. Marcus did not. He had moved slightly apart from the others, his hands resting quietly inside his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on the valley below with an expression Natalie could not quite name. He stood there long after the bugling had faded into the ridgeline, long after the rest of the group had moved on, still and quiet in the way of someone carrying something heavy that no one else can see. That night after Natalie fell asleep, Marcus sat alone at the small desk near the window of their hotel room. Outside, the temperature had dropped into the upper 30s, and the Rocky Mountains sat enormous and dark against a sky full of cold stars. He opened the small leather notebook he had carried in his bag since the start of the trip and wrote a single line, no date, no explanation, just the words themselves and his careful, even handwriting. I have been building a house. I cannot live inside. Then he closed the notebook, set it back inside his bag, returned to bed, and lay down beside his wife of 6 days. And he carried what he had always carried in silence, the way he had always carried it. The morning of September 22nd began the way the rest of the honeymoon had, quietly, without friction, without any visible sign that something was ending. They reviewed the checkout time with the front desk, talked over breakfast about which shops on Elkhorn Avenue they still wanted to visit before heading back toward Denver the following morning, and Marcus agreed with every plan Natalie suggested, nodding with the easy steadiness that had always felt to her like certainty. She had no reason to read it differently. She never had. By early afternoon, they were walking together through the heart of Estes Park's main street, a warm and unhurried stretch of locally owned boutiques, handmade craft shops, and small coffee houses tucked between the older store fronts, the kind of downtown that still feels like it belongs to the people who live there rather than to the people passing through. At 1:26 in the afternoon, a transaction record placed Marcus at a gift shop midway down the avenue where he paid cash for a small item. Investigators would later confirm the purchase. The receipt showed nothing unusual. He was still beside her. He was still present. And then at some point in the middle of the afternoon, something shifted so gently that Natalie did not feel it until it was already done. Just after 4 o'clock, Marcus checked his phone and told her he wanted to find a bank branch before it closed. He preferred to have cash on hand for the drive back, he said, in case anything unexpected came up. It was exactly the kind of practical, careful reasoning that had always defined him, and she had no reason to question it. She found a cafe nearby, ordered a coffee, and settled in to wait. At 4:18, a security camera mounted above a storefront on Elkhorn Avenue recorded Marcus walking alone toward the east end of the street. His pace was even. His posture was calm. There was nothing in the footage to suggest a man in distress. He looked, if anything, like a man who had made a decision and was walking toward it. At 4:47, he withdrew $400 in cash from an ATM near the bank branch. It was the last transaction ever recorded on his account. At 4:32, Natalie sent him a text message asking how it was going. The message was delivered. It was never read. By 5 o'clock, she called. Phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She assumed poor cell reception, which was common enough in the mountains. And she finished her coffee and told herself there was a reasonable explanation. But by 5:30, when the explanation still had not arrived, something quieter than fear, but heavier than worry, began to settle in her chest. She walked to the bank. It was already closed. The high-end vestibule was empty. She retraced the streets they had walked together that afternoon, checking the shops, scanning the sidewalks, calling his name once at a low volume that embarrassed her immediately. At 6:37, she returned to the hotel alone. She used her key card to open the room. His suitcase was still beside the closet. His laptop was still in its sleeve on the desk. His passport was still tucked inside the front pocket of his carry-on, exactly where he had placed it the morning they left Minneapolis. His phone was gone. His wallet was gone. He was gone. And the room which had been theirs just hours before now felt like a place that belonged only to the version of the trip that was no longer happening. At 7:12 that evening, Natalie called the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and reported her husband missing. Investigators arrived within the hour and began pulling the surveillance footage from businesses along the avenue. By late that night, they had located what they needed. The traffic camera near the junction leading onto Highway 36 had captured Marcus at 5:09 in the afternoon, standing beside a side access road at the edge of downtown. He waited for approximately 6 minutes. Then a gray SUV pulled up, slowed to a stop, and Marcus stepped into the passenger side. The vehicle merged onto Highway 36 heading west, and within seconds it was gone. The license plate was unreadable due to the angle of the late afternoon light. And here is the detail that would matter most to investigators in the days that followed. Rideshare services like Uber and Lyft operate almost not at all in Estes Park, regardless of the season. That gray SUV had not been summoned from an app. It had been arranged in advance by someone who had been planning this for longer than anyone realized. Before I tell you what investigators found next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone deeply and later realized there were whole rooms inside them you were never invited into? Rooms they kept locked, not out of cruelty, but out of a fear soul they could no longer remember when it started. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because what comes next in this story is not just about Marcus. It is about all of us. In the days that followed, search teams swept the terrain west of Estes Park toward the boundary of Roosevelt National Forest. On September 27th, a ranger conducting an off-road patrol approximately 11 miles west of the Highway 36 junction discovered a small black backpack partially concealed near an overgrown access path. Inside were a reusable water bottle, 2 unopened energy bars, and a wallet containing Marcus's Minnesota driver's license and his health insurance card. His bank cards were not there. His wedding ring was not there. The placement of the bag appeared deliberate, not dropped in panic, but set down with intention, as though someone had made a careful decision about what to leave behind and what to carry forward. As investigators widened their scope, a more complex portrait of Marcus Calloway began to take shape. Digital forensics revealed that in the summer of 2019, several months before he met Natalie at that Chicago conference, Marcus had quietly taken 18 days of unpaid leave from his previous firm. He had purchased a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon using a prepaid debit card, paid for his stay at a small hostel entirely in cash, and told no one in his family where he was going. No police reports were filed during that period. No disturbances were logged, but one former hostel staff member recalled that Marcus had spent long hours walking alone along the Willamette River and had occasionally attended meetings at a community center associated with identity support services. He had returned to Minneapolis in mid-July of that year, slipped back into his routine without explanation, and never mentioned the trip to anyone. Not then, not during 4 years with Natalie, not on their wedding day. Then, in August of 2023, 1 month before the ceremony, a single browser search was recovered from Marcus's phone history. Name changed procedures across state lines. No forms were downloaded. No follow-up searches were made. By the timestamp read 11:52 at night. Natalie had gone to bed before 10. Researchers who study identity-based psychological distress note that nearly 40% of men in America have never once discussed their mental health with anyone, not a friend, not a family member, not a professional. Not because they are not struggling, but because the culture they were raised in gave them no permission to. Marcus Calloway had been struggling in exactly that silence for a very long time. By November of 2023, investigators had a clearer picture of where Marcus had gone. What they still could not answer was why he had come so close to the altar, to the honeymoon, to the life that everyone around him had expected before finally walking away. The answer came 6 months later, not through a phone call, not through a news report, but through a plain white envelope that arrived at Marcus's parents' home in Duluth on an ordinary afternoon in March of 2024. There was no return address. The postmark read Santa Fe, New Mexico, dated March 14. His mother recognized the handwriting before she had even finished opening it, that careful, even script she had watched form itself across 20 years of birthday cards and holiday notes, and her hands went still. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. Marcus wrote that he was alive. He wrote that he was not in danger, that no one had coerced him, and that no one should be held responsible for what had happened except himself. He confirmed that the gray SUV had belonged to someone he had known for years, a person he did not name, and that the meeting had been arranged quietly and without a digital trace, because he had understood exactly what he was doing and had planned it with the same careful precision he had applied to every other decision in his adult life. He wrote that the marriage had not been a mistake in love. It had been a mistake in truth. For years he had been carrying a part of himself that he had never found the courage to speak aloud. In identity he had buried beneath the career, the routine, a savings account, and finally the wedding, believing each new milestone would press it down far enough that it would eventually stop surfacing. It never did. He wrote that marrying Natalie had not been an act of love alone. It had also been an act of avoidance. And he wrote that she deserved to have known the truth long before she ever signed her name beside his. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said only that he hoped in time she might find her way to something more honest than what he had been able to offer her. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed the letter was authentic. Law enforcement assessed it carefully and found no indicators of duress. And on March 22, 2024, authorities publicly acknowledged that the case of Marcus Elliott Calloway had been reclassified as a voluntary absence. Adults, they noted, had the legal right to relocate and begin again provided no crime has been committed. No crime had been. Natalie learned the news privately before the announcement was made public. Those closest to her said she did not speak for a long time after. She returned to therapy, this time focused not only on the grief of abandonment, but on the quieter, more complicated grief of realizing that the person she had loved had been living a version of himself that was never entirely real. In November of 2024, a Minnesota court formally recognized Marcus as a legally absent spouse, and Natalie began the process of dissolving the marriage through absence statutes. In January of 2025, she removed her wedding ring. She did not describe it as closure. She described it to a close friend as acknowledgement. Marcus's parents in Duluth kept the letter. His father read it once and did not speak of it again. His mother read it many times in the quiet of the kitchen after dinner and found herself asking a question she had no answer for. Had they, without ever meaning to, built a version of their son that left no room for the one he actually was? Somewhere in the mountains of New Mexico, the aspen trees still turn gold every September the way they always have, without asking anyone's permission, without waiting for the right moment, without wondering whether it is too late. They simply change fully and without apology, the way living things do when they have been given enough space to finally become what they were. Marcus had waited 39 years for that kind of space. Studies show that 58% of men in America feel pressure to suppress their emotions and show no weakness, and that 77% have experienced anxiety, stress, or depression without ever telling a single person. Marcus was not an outlier. He was a quiet, devastating example of what that silence costs, not only the man carrying it, but every person who loves him. Marcus did not disappear because he stopped loving Natalie. He disappeared because he had spent 39 years loving a version of himself that was never real. And in America, where a man's worth is measured by his stability, his title, and his composure, there is very little space to admit that the life you have carefully built does not fit the person living inside it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the conversations that never happened or the truths that stayed buried far too long, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Every story on this channel, the heartbreaks, the unexpected turns, the quiet courage of ordinary people trying to live honestly, exists because you choose to stay and listen. If these are the kinds of stories that matter to you, please subscribe to True Stories, the Tragedies and Comedies of Life, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you genuinely for being here.